What if the person you trusted most was hiding a truth that could unravel your entire world? For years, the protagonist and Margaret's marriage was a portrait of devotion, quiet dinners, shared laughter, and a bond that felt unbreakable. But lately, her smiles linger a second too short, her phone buzzes with secrets, and her eyes avoid his like a guilty shadow. It starts with subtle absences, vague excuses, and a guarded phone. Then comes the text, "Can't wait to see you tonight. Let's make it special," from a stranger named Harris. Suddenly, the man who vowed to trust forever becomes a detective in his own life, tracking lies through GPS coordinates and motel parking lots. As he uncovers proof of betrayal, a storm of rage and heartbreak threatens to consume him. But revenge whispers, louder than reason. How far will a good man go when love turns to lies? And what happens when the hunter becomes as dangerous as the secret he's chasing? The protagonist, an ordinary man with a quiet life, shared a deep bond with his wife Margaret. Their marriage was built on mutual trust and affection, a foundation that seemed unshakable. For years they lived comfortably, their lives intertwined in routine and familiarity. However, beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life, a subtle, unsettling shift began to take root. These they once shared slowly gave way to sense of something off, something hidden in the spaces between their words and actions. The normality of their days began to feel ever so slightly like a mask. It started with the small, almost imperceptible changes in Margaret's behavior. She began staying late at work, her absences growing more frequent yet, always with vague, unspecific reasons. Her phone, once left carelessly around, was now guarded, with a vigilance he hadn't noticed before. She would glance at it, then quickly slip it out of sight whenever he walked by. At first the protagonist dismissed these signs, telling himself it was just stress or a temporary shift in routine. But as days turned into weeks, a sense of unease grew in him. It was the way she now avoided eye contact when speaking, or how she became strangely defensive when he asked simple questions. Slowly doubt crept in, but he ignored it, unwilling to face what it might mean for their once happy marriage. One evening, as the protagonist picked up his wife's phone to check something, a text message caught his eye. It was from someone named Harris, a name he didn't recognize. His thumb hovered over the message, a chill running down his spine. The message was unmistakably intimate, hinting at something far beyond friendship. The words were clear enough: "Can't wait to see you tonight. Let's make it special." The shock hit him like a wave, leaving him breathless. He didn't want to believe it, but there it was, undeniable. For a moment, he thought of closing the phone, pretending he hadn't seen it. But the truth had already taken root, and a storm of emotions began to swirl within him. He felt betrayed, confused, and lost, unsure whether to confront her immediately or bury the suspicion and hope it was nothing. Unable to ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut, the protagonist decided he needed answers, even if it betraying his own sense of morality. The decision weighed heavily on him, but he couldn't simply sit in ignorance any longer. He installed a GPS tracker in Margaret's car, watching from a distance as she unknowingly drove away. Each new data point fed his growing suspicion: late-night drives, secretive routes, and stops in places he had never known her to visit. His heart raced as he watched the dots on the map, but with every piece of information he gathered, a sense of dread settled deeper. He was no longer the man he once was, a man who trusted and believed in his wife. Instead, he had become a man on a mission, torn between his love for her and the undeniable truth that was beginning to emerge. The protagonist's investigation continued, each day blurring into the next, as he watched Margaret's every move. Texts, photos, recordings. He gathered them, each new piece of evidence, a nail in the coffin of their marriage. His anxiety grew with each passing moment. Margaret's secrecy was becoming unbearable every time she answered her phone or left the house. His suspicions deepened. He couldn't ignore it any longer. One night, as Margaret casually mentioned, meeting a friend for dinner, the protagonist knew this was it. This was the night he would get the answers he needed. His heart pounded as he prepared, knowing full well what he was about to do. The once loving and trusting man was now a stranger to himself, caught in a web of betrayal and deceit, and as he followed her that evening, he braced himself for the truth. To finally reveal itself, the protagonist followed Margaret. That night, his hands gripping the wheel as the GPS tracker led him to her destination. He watched as she pulled into the parking lot of a small, discreet motel. The anxiety in his chest boiled over into rage, and he could hardly breathe as his worst fears were confirmed. Harris, the man from the text, she saw them together stepping out of her car, laughing, sharing moments that should have been his. His mind raced with a chaotic mix of anger, betrayal, and hurt. He wanted to confront them, scream at them, but instead he sat still, stewing in the agony of his thoughts. His eyes narrowed in determination. He could let them just drive off like nothing had happened. The wheels of revenge began to turn in his mind. Stepping out of his car, he grabbed a knife and slashed the tires off Margaret's car, ensuring they couldn't leave. He felt a strange satisfaction in the act, as though it was the only way he could regain control of the situation. He was ready for the confrontation. His body tense and his mind focused on what would happen next. As Margaret and Harris exited the motel, the protagonist appeared from the shadowless car idling nearby. They froze, clearly shocked by his presence. He didn't say a word at first, just watched them with cold eyes. They exchanged uneasy glances, trying to mask their surprise. Margaret's face twisted in confusion, her eyes darting to Harris as if searching for a way out. The protagonist's voice was calm, too calm. "Need a ride?" he asked, his words cutting through the tension. Margaret hesitated, her face draining of color. But Harris nodded nervously, getting into the car as they drove the atmosphere in. The car grew heavy, the silence was palpable, and the two passengers fidgeted in their seats, unsure of what to expect. The protagonist didn't look at them. Instead, he kept his eyes focused on the road, his grip on the steering wheel, tightening. The miles passed in eerie quiet. But as they neared a secluded stretch of road, the protagonist finally spoke again. "You didn't think I'd find out, did you?" Margaret's fear began to show as she realized they were heading deeper into nowhere, with no easy way out. The car came to a halt on the deserted road. The only sound, the hum of the engine without a word. The protagonist stepped out of the car, his eyes locking with Margaret's for a moment before he walked around to the trunk. He retrieved their phones and tossed them into the river. Nearby, his actions deliberate and final. The silence that followed was suffocating. Margaret screamed, her voice filled with desperation and disbelief. But the protagonist only felt a cold satisfaction wash over him. There would be no way for them to reach anyone now. Margaret's eyes filled with panic as the reality of their situation sank in. The protagonist didn't flinch. He climbed back into the car, ignoring their frantic plays. "Good luck getting home," he said, his voice a chilling whisper in the quiet night. The couple sat frozen in shock, stranded in the middle of nowhere, processing the horror of their new reality. The next morning, Margaret returned home, her face streaked with tears, her voice trembling as she begged for forgiveness. The protagonist, unmoved by her pleas, handed her a thick folder filled with all the evidence he had gathered. He looked at her one final time, his voice firm and resolute. "I want you to leave. It's over." His heart was heavy, but it was also lighter than it had been in months. He had taken control, had ended the torment. The woman who once meant everything to him was now a stranger. The weight of betrayal had lifted. But at a cost. The protagonist smiled as he leaned back in his chair, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. He had sent Harris's wife the evidence, a carefully prepared package with all the details of her husband's infidelity. The satisfaction of knowing Harris was now, out on the streets, rejected by the woman he had deceived, filled the protagonist with a sense of justice. It was the kind of karma that felt too sweet to ignore. The world had a way of righting itself, and he had played his part. Harris's fall. From Grace was the final chapter in this painful story, as the protagonist rebuilt his life. A sense of peace began to settle over him. The divorce had been a painful but necessary step in reclaiming his future. He felt stronger, more confident, no longer the man consumed by the lies and betrayals of the past. With each passing day the scars faded, replaced by the promise of something new. And every time he passed the stretch of road where he had left Margaret and Harris, stranded a small, knowing smile tugged at his lips. He had survived, and in the end, it was they who had been broken, not him. The divorce papers sat, unsigned for weeks, but the protagonist never wavered. Margaret's tearful pleas echoed in empty rooms, yet his resolve hardened, a fortress built on the rubble of trust. When Harris's wife returned his evidence with a note, "Thank you," he finally exhaled. Karma had spun its web, leaving both betrayers exiled from the lives they'd shattered. Now the protagonist drinks his coffee alone, the silence no longer suffocating but serene. He walks past the motel sometimes, its neon sign flickering like a forgotten ghost. Strangers call him cold, but he knows the truth. Surviving betrayal isn't about cruelty. It's about reclaiming the pieces love once stole. In the end, the road that stranded Margaret and Harris became his metaphor. Life, like that desolate stretch, forces you to keep moving, even when the path ahead is dark.